the odds, whether against the fascist threat in the Second World War, the international brigades that supported the people of Spain against Franco, or support by the American people for Vietnamese resistance to U.S. imperialism in the 1960s and 70s. The situation in Yemen demands that the country is at the front lines of a new sort of conflict instigated by the global powers, one in which the people of the world must in kind work creatively and urgently to address it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. We'll go right to our next speaker here, and that is Sobia Akhtar, who's going to be giving us a reading from the news that really presents the scope and the number of people that are at risk of famine this year.
Hello everyone. I will be presenting some of the statistical data on as to what is going on in Yemen and how many people have been affected as of now. Yemen as of now has an estimated population of 28 million, with 46% of the population being under 15 years of age. In February of this year, 4 of the United Nations agencies came out with this data where they mentioned that more than 2 million Yemeni children under the age of 5 are expected to endure acute malnutrition this year, urging stakeholders to end the years-long conflict that has brought the Arab world's poorest country to the brink of famine. The UN report warned that nearly 1 in 6 of those kids, which estimates to about 400,000 children of the 2.3 million, are at risk of death due to severe acute malnutrition, which is a significant increase from last year's estimates. The report also mentioned that the lack of funds was hampering humanitarian programs in Yemen, as donor nations have failed to make good on their commitments. Compounding the crisis, around 1.2 million pregnant or breastfeeding women in Yemen are also projected to be acutely malnourished this year. These numbers are yet another cry for help from Yemen, which are malnourished children, where each malnourished children also means a family struggling to survive. This was stated by David Beasley, who is the executive director of the World Food Program. He also mentioned that the crisis in Yemen is a toxic mix of conflict, economic collapse, and a severe shortage of funding. In 2020, humanitarian programs in Yemen received only $1.9 billion of their $3.4 billion, which the report also mentioned. UNICEF estimates that virtually all of Yemen's 12 million children require some sort of assistance. This can include food aid, health services, clean water, schooling, and cash grants to help the poorest families scrape by. With that being said, only 25% of rural areas are covered by health services, and that should be another point of focus. Beasley, who is the executive director, also mentioned that there is a solution to hunger, and that's food and end to the violence. Yemenis have suffered 6 years of bloodshed, destruction, and humanitarian catastrophe. In 2014, the Iran-allied Houthi rebels seized the capital and much of the country's north. A Saudi-led coalition launched a sweeping military intervention months later to restore the UN-backed government. Despite the relentless Saudi airstrikes and a blockade of Yemen, the war has ground to a stalemate. Earlier this year, our President Joe Biden announced that the U.S. will no longer support the Saudi-led coalition, but reaching peace will be a difficult path. Biden also reversed the Trump administration designation of Houthis as a terrorist organization. That move has been hailed by aid groups working in Yemen, who feared that the designation would disrupt the flow of food, fuel, and other goods, barely keeping the Yemenis alive. The WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom has said that malnourished children are more vulnerable to diseases, which is a fact. It is a vicious and often deadly cycle, but with relatively cheap and simple interventions, many lives can be saved. Due to the 2015 Yemeni civil war, the situation is increasingly dire. 80% of the Yemenis population struggle to access water to drink and bathe. Bombing has forced many Yemenis to leave their homes for other areas, and so wells in those areas are under increasing pressure.
Thank you very much. Next up, we're going to hear some poetry by David Rothhauser. Thanks, David.
I am the source of Yemen's agony. Call me by my rightful name. I am Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. No one can stop me. Thousands try. Oh, how they try. They stand outside my windows by day and night. Their lips in a creative, surreal dance, calling out words I cannot hear behind my soundproof, bulletproof windows. They send bushels of petitions to the great white father in the great white house, begging, imploring, demanding that I cease and desist. All the while I feast on their names, on their faceless names. The streets they live on, I devour ravenously like the Goliath I so proudly am. They beg me to save Yemeni children while they turn a blind eye to the daily slaughter of their very own here in America. The daily barbecue improvised by the NRA of guns, guns, guns. Yemen, the once proud kingdom of the Sheikh of Araby, broken by the Balfour Agreement, Lawrence of Arabia, Sykes-Picot. Yemen today, merely my appetizer to the forever pipeline of deep black blood. I'm insatiable. I stand alone. I know no flag, no God, no moral. You voted to protect me. You voted for the Commerce in Arms Act. I'm the only business in America completely immunized from liability when crimes are committed using my weapons of mass destruction. My weapons or your national security. My weapons or your wealth to the moon and Mars. My weapons make humanitarian aid. My weapons make jobs for the hungry in America. You protect me. You make me feel good about who I am. I am the source of Yemen's agony. I throw down the gauntlet. My portals are open. I welcome you. Step inside. Track me down. See me face to face. Talk to me. Destroy the source of Yemen's agony. Repeal the law that you voted for to protect me. Repeal the Commerce in Arms Act. Repeal it. The choice is yours, if you dare. You know my rightful name. I am Raytheon. I'm Raytheon. I am Boeing. I am Lockheed Martin. I am the source of Yemen's agony.
Thank you, David. Next up, we're going to hear from Ryan Costello from United Against War and Militarism.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, David, for that very powerful reading. So, juggle this. I'm reading an article from April 27th of this year. The U.S. may still be helping Saudi Arabia in the Yemen war after all. Surprise, I know. The U.S. authorized contractors to service Saudi warplanes. Some of those warplanes fight in the Yemen war. That's the subtitle. In February, President Joe Biden announced that he was ending America's offensive support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. That's a typo. I should say Saudi Arabia and the U.S.'s war in Yemen, but it's okay. 6 years into the conflict that has killed around 100,000 people and triggered the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Instead, the U.S. role will be limited to defensive operations to, quote, support and help Saudi Arabia defend its sovereignty and its territorial integrity and its people. There's just one problem. The line between offensive and defensive support is murky, and the critics argue even the limited support the U.S. is providing still helps Riyadh carry out its offensive bombing campaign in Yemen. Since 2015, the U.S. has supported the Saudi-led coalition's fight against the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. Until November 2018, that support included refueling Saudi warplanes that dropped bombs on Yemen, many of which killed civilians, including children. The Trump administration ended that practice after increased pressure from activists and lawmakers about Riyadh's brutal conduct in the conflict. But the U.S. continued to provide logistical and intelligence support for the Saudi war effort and planned to sell billions in advanced weapons like precision-guided missiles to the Saudis. With Biden's new policy, the U.S. would stop all of the above and solely help Saudi Arabia defend its territory against threats from the Houthis and elsewhere. Biden's policy sounds straightforward enough. For the past few months, the U.S. made a clean break and no longer provides assistance to Riyadh's ongoing strikes against Yemen, right? Not quite. That's because the defensive support for the U.S. is still providing includes greenlighting the servicing of Saudi aircrafts. Multiple U.S. defense officials and experts acknowledge that through a U.S. government process, the Saudi government pays commercial contractors to maintain and service the aircraft. And those contractors keep the Saudi warplanes in the air. What the Saudis do with those fighter jets, however, is up to them. The U.S. could cancel those contracts at any time, thus effectively grounding the Saudi Air Force, but doing so would risk losing Riyadh as a key regional partner. The reality of the situation then is squishy enough that the administration says it's following Biden's directive in securing its interests in the Middle East, while critics say that Biden's team is indirectly supporting the Saudi-led coalition and offensive operations in Yemen. And other critics would say they're going so far as directly supporting them. Lawmakers on the House Foreign Affairs Committee asked Tim Lenderking, the State Department's special envoy for Yemen, last Wednesday about the new policy. His response was wanting. He said he was, quote, not totally in the loop, and that the panel should ask the Pentagon for specifics. A reporter the next day asked Marine General Kenneth F. McKenzie, who oversees all U.S. troops in the Middle East, to provide some clarity. He responded that, when possible, the U.S. military provides Saudis with warning of any incoming attacks on Saudi Arabia, and that the U.S. has detected attacks coming from Yemen. The United States continues to provide support to the Saudi Air Force, given the critical role it plays in the Saudi air defense and our long-standing security partnership, said Navy Commander Jessica McNulty, a Pentagon spokesperson. While more specific than the administration has been to date, the statement still wasn't entirely clear. Was the U.S. military directly providing that support? And did the maintenance go to Saudi fighter jets, its missile defense system, or both? So I asked McNulty to clarify her statement, which she did on Monday in an email. The quote, the Department of Defense supports Saudi aircraft maintenance through foreign military sales to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for which Saudi Arabia bears the cost and implementation is conducted by DoD contractors, she wrote. That means that Riyadh, with its own money and at no cost to the U.S. taxpayer, uses a government program to procure maintenance for its warplanes. That service was likely included when the Saudis bought American-made warplanes. It may not be the U.S. military providing direct support then, but the service was still greenlit by the U.S. This doesn't please critics of the war and America's role in it. A Democratic congressional aide complained, "Oh great, they're receiving their civilian contractors line," adding that the U.S. approved service to provide maintenance and spare parts for the Saudi aircraft is tantamount to America backing Riyadh's offensive plans. Others agreed. The recent admission by the Department of Defense that the U.S. companies are still authorized to maintain Saudi warplanes means that our government is still enabling Saudi operations, including bombing and enforcing a blockade on Yemen's port. Hassan Al-Tayyib, the legislative manager for Middle East policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation Lobbying Group, told me the administration should use its existing authority to block U.S. military contractors from aiding the Saudi war effort. Sorry, there's a series of highlights here, so I'm trying to figure out what exactly to focus on. Would potentially losing Saudi Arabia as a partner be worth essentially grounding its Air Force? The Biden administration seems to have calculated that it's not. Put together, it seems likely that U.S. authorized contractors maintaining Saudi warplanes are indirectly involved in helping the Saudis carry out offensive operations, however one defines them. If we're servicing planes that are fighting the war, we're still supporting the war, said the Democratic congressional aide. That the contract remains in place, after all, is a policy decision. The U.S. could decide to maintain other equipment and provide training instead of keeping the Saudi aircrafts in the sky. And that's it.
Thanks, Ryan. Next up, we're going to hear a bit more poetry from Skip Shield. Thanks, Skip.
From Mahmoud Darwish, Palestinian poet, his poem called In Jerusalem, translated by Fadi Judah. In Jerusalem, and I mean within the ancient walls, I walk from one epoch to another without a memory to guide me. The prophets over there are sharing the history of the holy, ascending to heaven and returning less discouraged and melancholy, because love and peace are holy and are coming to town. I was walking down a slope and thinking to myself, how do the narrators disagree over what light said about a stone? Is it from a dimly lit stone that wars flare up? I walk in my sleep, I stare in my sleep, I see no one behind me, I see no one ahead of me. All this light is for me. I walk, I become lighter. I fly, then I become another, transfigured. Words sprout like grass from Isaiah's messenger mouth. If you don't believe, you won't be safe. I walk as if I were another, and my wound a white biblical rose. In my hands, like two doves on the cross, hovering and carrying the earth. I don't walk, I fly. I become another, transfigured. No place and no time. So who am I? I am no I in ascension's presence, but I think to myself alone. The Prophet Muhammad spoke classical Arabic. And then what? Then what? The woman soldier shouted, is that you again? Didn't I kill you? I said, you killed me, and I forgot, like you, to die.
Thank you, Skip. Much appreciated. Next up, we're going to hear from Joan Eckline, who has another article about the cost.
I think that most of the things that have been said have already been said. There's only one thing that hasn't been said, and that they're on the tip of a terrible famine, and the UN is aware of that. And they say that hostilities have directly caused tens of thousands of civilian casualties, 3,153 child deaths, and 5,600 children were verified the first 5 years of the conflict, and 1,500 civilian casualties were reported in the first 9 months. The chief UN humanitarian official in Yemen, Alif Musani, the acting humanitarian coordinator for Yemen, okay. The people from the United Nations say the killing of children is appalling. Children should be protected at all times. Yemen's complex civil war began in earnest in 2015, foisting disease, hunger, and economic collapse on an already impoverished population. In 2020, the violence escalated and the hardship deepened with torrential rains, a fuel crisis, COVID-19, and desert locust infestations. They all together, they lost about $222 million. I think that the most thing that I really want to say is the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, warned that Yemen was in imminent danger of the worst famine the world has seen for decades. And Henrietta Fore, head of the UN Children's Fund, said the country was facing an imminent catastrophe. So we don't have much time to spare, and it should be very focused on getting food to these people.
Sorry, I switched sides on you there, Joan. Thank you, Joan. And next up, we're going to be hearing from John Bach, who's joining us from the Friends meeting at Cambridge today. Thanks, John.
First, our thanks to Paul Shannon, Thea Paneth, Brian Garvey for putting this together, others from Mass Peace Action and the Raytheon Anti-War Committee. Thank you all for this chance to respond to the horrors in Yemen, and also for giving us the chance to be the people we purport to be, those who give a good goddamn about what's happening in the rest of the world, especially with the consent of our government. It's like what Ellsberg said about Vietnam. He said, we weren't on the wrong side, we were the wrong side. My reading comes from a trial testimony, the transcript of the trial of the Catonsville Nine. In 1967, during the trial of during the height of the Vietnam War, 9 people, all religious, went into a draft board in Catonsville, Maryland, took 379 1A files, put them in metal baskets, took them outside, and burned them with a concoction of homemade napalm. Interestingly, equal parts gasoline and ivory snowflakes. For that, of course, they were arrested, tried, and eventually imprisoned. This is from the trial transcript of Philip Berrigan, talking about what happens when you try to seek administrative redress through legislative channels. We always tried to gauge our activity in terms of the reality of the war. We started with prayer vigils, with meals of reconciliation, with a few tentative marches, with readathons. In downtown Baltimore, we began to demonstrate at military bases. We went to Fort Myers, Virginia. Fort Myers is the home of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We tried to contact men like General Wheeler and General Johnson, former Chiefs of Staff of the Army, to tell them of our concerns, to sit down with them, citizen to leader. The military were immune from any citizen influence. They were a law unto themselves. General Wheeler ignored our letters, so we went to his home and demonstrated outside. We were forced to leave. We came back in a month's time and were forced out again. And the third time, we were forcibly ejected. Apart from these attempts, I always tried continually to keep in touch with the Congress. I made a proposal to Senator Fulbright, suggesting it might be a good thing to investigate the war in light of the moral opinion of the nation. We plan to bring a team of theologians to testify before the Foreign Relations Committee. Fulbright was partial to the idea, but he never had any political leverage, particularly from the churches. So of course our idea died of burning. At Christmas in 1967, I also spent 2 hours with Secretary Rusk. I went to his office with another clergy person. We discussed all aspects of the war. He was very gracious, but he did not tell us anything he had not said before, and that was not enough for us. I'll be back later.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate it. Next up, we're going to hear from one of the founders of the Raytheon anti-war campaign, and that is Paul Shannon. Let's hear it for him.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for everyone for being here today to call attention to the war, but immediately to the blockade that at this very moment is leading to mass starvation in Yemen. The World Health Organization tells us that unless that blockade is lifted within a month, there will be a massive famine this summer in Yemen. It is time to act now. I'm reading from a New York Times article from April of 2020. Year after year, the bombs fell on wedding tents, funeral halls, fishing boats, and a school bus, killing thousands of civilians and helping turn Yemen into the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Weapons supplied by American companies, approved by American officials, allowed Saudi Arabia to pursue the reckless campaign. But in June 2017, an influential Republican senator decided to cut them off by withholding approval of new sales. It was a moment that might have stopped the slaughter. American arms makers who sell to the Saudis say they are accountable to shareholders and are doing nothing wrong. And because weapons sales to foreign militaries must be approved by the State Department, the companies say they don't make policy, they only follow it. But as the situation in Yemen worsened, at least one firm, Raytheon Company of Waltham, Massachusetts, did more than wait for decisions by American officials. It went to great lengths to influence those decisions, even after members of Congress tried to upend sales to Saudi Arabia on humanitarian grounds. Raytheon, a major supplier of weapons to the Saudis, including some implicated by human rights groups in the deaths of Yemeni civilians, has long viewed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as one of its most important foreign customers. After the Yemen war began in 2015, and the Obama administration made a hasty decision to back the Saudis, Raytheon booked more than $3 billion in new bomb sales, according to an analysis of available U.S. government records. Intent on pushing the deals through, Raytheon followed the industry playbook. It took advantage of federal loopholes by sending former State Department officials who were not required to be registered as lobbyists to press their former colleagues to approve the sales. And though the company was already embedded in Washington, its chief lobbyist, Mark Esper, would become Army Secretary and then Defense Secretary under President Trump. Raytheon executives sought even closer ties. As the nation turned against the war, a range of American officials, Democratic and Republican, tried 3 times to halt the killing by blocking arms to the Saudis. Their efforts were undone by the White House, largely at the urging of Raytheon. Approached a half a dozen times, Raytheon representatives declined to speak with reporters about foreign sales. Quote, "We believe further dialogue regarding foreign military sales is best directed to officials in the U.S. government," Corin Kowalski, then a company spokesman, said in December. Lawmakers from both parties have condemned the continued arms sales in the Yemen war, expressing both humanitarian and security concerns. Some of those weapons have found their way into the hands of militant Islamic groups in Yemen. We don't know how these weapons are really being used or whether they may be turned against U.S. troops in the future, said Senator Mike Lee, Republican of Utah, who has publicly criticized the administration's approach to the conflict. This war was never authorized by Congress. As the war broke out 5 years ago in Yemen, Raytheon was a company on the rebound. Based in Waltham, Massachusetts, it had risen over the years to become the 3rd largest defense firm in the United States, bolstered by its sales of best-known system, the Patriot missile, made in Andover, Massachusetts. But Raytheon had been battered by flagging profits and federal budget cuts, and Mr. Kennedy, the chief executive, was determined to turn things around, starting with international sales. Raytheon earned more of its revenue from sales to foreign governments than Lockheed Martin and other defense giants. And few foreign customers were more important than Saudi Arabia. Its ties with the Saudis dated to the 1960s, when the company became one of the first American defense firms to build a permanent base in Saudi Arabia. Since then, generations of Raytheon executives had sought to ingratiate the company with the Saudis, hiring members of the royal family as consultants, building schools, and investing in projects favored by the royal court. The close relationship was evident 2 days after the attacks of September 11, 2001, when 3 Saudi college students began their journey out of the country from Raytheon's private terminal in Tampa, Florida. None of the men, including one who was a member of the Saudi royal family, was tied to the attacks. Those Saudi nationals were among the hijackers. The long-standing ties helped Mr. Kennedy turn around the company. Since the Yemen war began, Raytheon has booked at least a dozen major sales to the kingdom and its partners worth more than $5 billion. U.S. government records show, helping lift the firm's fortune and position it to pursue a merger with another large defense company, United Technologies, that was completed in April 2020. Some of the deals for defensive items sailed through the government approval process but sales of offensive weapons, including more than 120,000 precision bombs and bomb parts that the Saudis were using in Yemen, faced major hurdles. Those deals were among the most lucrative ones, worth more than $3 billion, the government record shows. The article goes on. I'm just going to close by reading a short section of what these bombs really mean to people in Yemen. Let me close with this. Trouble for the company started on October 8, 2016, when Saudi coalition planes repeatedly targeted a funeral hall in Sana'a, the Yemeni capital, where some 1,500 men, women, and children had gathered to mourn the father of a government official. The first bomb shattered the building, killing some instantly and sending others on a scramble to escape the smoldering rubble. A second landed as people poured it in to help the survivors. A third fell as the newly injured and dying were clambering amid splintered wood and broken concrete. Quote, people were on fire and some people were burned alive, one survivor, 42-year-old Hassan Juran, told human rights workers. There were also many children, he said. There were 3 children whose bodies were completely torn apart and strewn all over the place. At least 140 people died and another 500 were wounded in the bombing, which the Saudis later said was a mistake. Soon after the attack, human rights workers discovered among the wreckage a bomb shard bearing the identification number of an American company, Raytheon.
Thank you, Paul. So we are here to end the war in Yemen, because even though many Americans don't know that there's a war going on in Yemen, and they don't know that we're fueling it, you better believe the people of Yemen know that this is an American war. Raytheon is making billions off of this war, and it is up to the people of Massachusetts to say no more. So right now we're going to hear from Elizabeth Lee, if she's in the crowd, to read a bit more poetry for us. I haven't seen Elizabeth yet. Is Elizabeth out there? No, not yet. Well, we'll go to her after. Next, we're going to hear from Thea Paneth, who is the main organizer behind this event, who's going to read a little poetry for us.
Thanks, Brian. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this good? Is this all right? This is an excerpt from Atlas of the Difficult World by Adrian Rich. Here is a map of our country. Here is the sea of indifference, glazed with salt. This is the haunted river flowing from brow to groin. We dare not taste its water. This is the desert where missiles are planted like corms. This is the breadbasket of foreclosed farms. This is the birthplace of the rockabilly boy. This is the cemetery of the poor who died for democracy. This is a battlefield from a 19th century war. The shrine is famous. This is the sea town of myth and story, where the fishing fleets went bankrupt. Here is where the jobs were, on the pier, processing frozen fish sticks, hourly wages, and no shares. These are other battlefields, Centralia, Detroit. Here are the forests primeval, the copper, the silver lodes. These are the suburbs of acquiescence, silence rising fume-like from the streets. This is the capital of money and dolor, whose spires flare up through air inversions, whose bridges are crumbling, whose children are drifting, blind alleys pent between coiled rolls of razor wire. I promised to show you a map, you say, but this is a mural. Then yes, let it be. These are small distinctions. Where do we see it from is the question.
Thank you, Thea. Next up, we're going to hear from the Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action, Cole Harrison.
Thank you, Brian. I've got an article from In These Times entitled, "Here's Exactly Who's Profiting from the War in Yemen." I had to cut the article down because it's longer, but these are some of the key points. This was written in May of 2019, 2 years ago, and it's only gotten worse since then. The war in Yemen has been particularly lucrative for General Dynamics, Boeing, and Raytheon, which have received hundreds of millions of dollars in Saudi weapons deals. All three corporations have highlighted business with Saudi Arabia in their reports to shareholders. Since the war began in March 2015, General Dynamics stock price has risen from about 135 to 169 per share. Raytheon's from 108 to more than 180, and Boeing's from about 150 to 360 as of April 2019. A spokesman for Boeing said the company follows guidance from the United States government, while Raytheon replied, "You will need to contact the U.S. government." The State Department declined to comment. The weapons contractors are correct on one point. They're working hand in glove with the State Department. By law, the department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs must approve any arms sales by U.S. companies to foreign governments. U.S. law also prohibits sales to countries that indiscriminately kill civilians, as the Saudi-led military coalition bombing Yemen did in the Mastaba strike in 2016 and many other documented cases. But ending sales to Saudi Arabia would cost the U.S. arms industry its biggest global customer. And to do that, Congress must cross an industry which pours millions into the campaigns of lawmakers of both parties. According to an In These Times analysis of reports by Human Rights Watch and by the Yemeni group Muatana for Human Rights, the Saudi-led coalition, including the UAE, has used U.S. weapons to kill at least 434 people and injure at least 1,004 people in attacks that overwhelmingly include civilians and civilian targets. Most of the weapons that we have found and been able to identify in strikes that appear unlawful have been U.S. weapons, says Priyanka Modaparthi, a researcher for Human Rights Watch. Factories have been hit. Farmlands have been hit with cluster bombs. Not only have they killed civilians, but they have also destroyed livelihoods and contributed to a dire humanitarian situation. The U.S. government is now on notice that there's a high likelihood these weapons could be used in strikes that violate the laws of war. According to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, the United States may not authorize arms exports to governments that consistently engage in gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. The Arms Export Control Act of 1976 stipulates that exported weapons may only be used for a country's defense. Saudi Arabia's precision-guided munitions are responsible for the vast majority of deaths documented by human rights groups. In These Times found that since 2009, Saudi Arabia has ordered more than 27,000 missiles, worth at least 1.8 billion from Raytheon alone, plus 6,000 guided bombs from Boeing, worth about 332 million, and 1,300 cluster munitions from Rhode Island-based Textron, worth $640 million. About 650 million of those Raytheon orders, and an estimated 103 million of the Boeing orders came after the Saudi war in Yemen began. I'm getting hoarse from trying to talk loud, so I think I have to stop. I'll pass it over.
Thank you, Carl. Next up, we're going to hear from Nate Goldschlag from Veterans for Peace. He's going to be reading a speech that I try to listen to every April 4th, and one that is just as true today as it was when it was given, first delivered over 50 years ago.
On April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King gave an incredible speech, a landmark speech at Riverside Church in New York City. It was 1 year to the day before he was assassinated. It was the first time that he came out very strongly against the war in Vietnam. The speech was called Beyond Vietnam, and in it he mentioned that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world was his own government. These are excerpts from that speech. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrasts of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say, this is not just. It will look at the alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into veins of people normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. There is nothing to keep us from molding a recalcitrant status quo with bruised hands until we have fashioned it into a brotherhood. Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1967.
Thank you, Nate. As I'm sure all of you know, Martin Luther King would be shot and killed 1 year later to the day in Memphis while he was struggling to get more rights for sanitation workers. And as he was beginning his Poor People's Campaign. Next, we're going to hear from Anna Milosavljevic, who's going to read us a bit of poetry. Give it up for Anna.
Hi, everyone. All right, I'm going to be reading a poem by Marge Piercy. It's called To Be of Use. The people I love the best jump into work head first, without dallying in the shallows, and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black, sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves, an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. The work of the world is common as mud. Botched, it smears the hands, crumbles to dust. But the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Green amphoras for wine or oil, hoopy vases that held corn are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Next, we're going to turn the mic back over to John Bach, who is going to finish the statement from Daniel Berrigan that he was reading earlier. Let's hear it for John.
Thank you. There have been frequent references to Raytheon this morning, or this afternoon. I want you to know, by way of invitation, that for the last number of years, the Quakers have been spending an hour in silence outside of the Raytheon laboratory on Concord Avenue with a sign that says, "Humanity thrives on peace. Raytheon thrives on war." Please join us. This is also from the transcript of the trial of the Catonsville Nine, written by Daniel Berrigan. Months after this trial, he was put in federal prison for 2 years. He said, "Our apologies, good friends, our apologies for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children, the angering of the orderlies in the front parlor of the charnel house. We could not, so help us God, do otherwise, for we are sick at heart. Our hearts give us no rest, thinking of the land of burning children or the land of starving children." All of us who act against the law turn to the poor of the world, to the Vietnamese, to the Yemenis, to the victims, to the soldiers who kill and die for the wrong reasons, for no reason at all, because they were so ordered by the authorities of that public order, which is in effect a massive institutionalized disorder. We say killing is disorder. Life and gentleness and community and unselfishness is the only order we recognize. For the sake of that order, we risk our liberty, our good name. The time is past when good men may be silent, when obedience can segregate men from public risk, When the poor can die without defense, how many indeed must die before our voices are heard? How many must be tortured, dislocated, starved, maddened? How long must the world's resources be raped in the service of legalized murder? When, at what point, will you say no to this war? We have chosen to say with the gift of our liberty, if necessary our lives, the violence stops here. The death stops here. The suppression of the truth stops here. The war stops here. Redeem the times.
Thank you, John. And now for our last speaker, we're going to give the mic back to Ryan Costello, who's going to read a statement by a very brave activist who put her body on the line to raise awareness about the catastrophe in Yemen.
Thank you, everyone. This is an opinion piece in the Washington Post from April 8th of this year by Iman Saleh. The title is, "I'm on hunger strike until the U.S. ends all support for the Saudi-led blockade against Yemen." And Iman is the general coordinator of the Yemeni liberation movement. My name is Iman, and I am entering the 11th day of my hunger strike in Washington, D.C. I'm a Yemeni American, and for years I have watched helplessly as the Saudi coalition, backed by the United States, has blocked food and basic necessities from reaching my family and my people as part of an illegal war, creating one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. At least 400,000 Yemeni children under 5 could die of starvation this year without urgent intervention, according to 4 United Nations agencies. The siege against Yemen not only has had a crippling effect on everyday life, but is also compounding the ongoing conflict in the country, causing damage that exceeds even the violence itself in both scale and intensity. During the past few days, I have marched and chanted and drummed my way through the streets of Washington. I have cried and laughed and sung with whatever voice I was able to muster. I have linked arms with other hunger strikers, with my sister, friends, and strangers. I have strived to not only imagine a more just world, but also to demand one. After days without food, I have lost much of my short-term memory. Day in and day out, I feel the physical burden of starvation that my people have endured for so long. But my pain cannot amount to that of Yemenis under siege. I am starving, but I am not being starved. I am suffering, but I can choose to end that suffering. To go on hunger strike is to put my body, my very physical existence, in the line of fire. It is not nonviolent to go on hunger strike. Starvation is an attack on the body, a last resort. As I write this, my body is breaking itself down to keep me alive. The blockade on Yemen prevents fuel from entering the country, a key to survival in any war zone. Fuel heats stoves, powers engines, lights buildings, and allows for the foundation of an economy to be rebuilt, so that a nation may have some hope of feeding itself on a larger scale. Without fuel, hospitals are unable to run their generators. Food remains at ports, unable to be transported to towns and villages where starvation is rampant. Without fuel, Yemen will bleed dry until no blood remains. In the past few weeks, the blockade has reached a critical stage, with food reserves totally depleted and thousands of children at grave risk of imminent starvation. Time has run out. We are no longer waiting for a human tragedy to unfold. It has unfolded. Yemenis are experiencing famine, displacement, poverty, a deadly outbreak of cholera, lack of medical aid, and no access to education. This urgent situation persuaded my friends and me in the Yemeni liberation movement to bring attention to our people's plight. We are on strike with one demand: that the United States end all support to the Saudi blockade causing mass starvation in Yemen. In February, President Biden announced that he would end, quote, all American support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen, including relevant arms sales. But neither Biden nor Congress has taken any concrete steps to end the support. For the administration, this will require only the stroke of a pen and a series of commands issued to the U.S. military. We do not believe these actions would end the war in Yemen, but they would certainly be effective steps towards alleviating an unimaginable amount of suffering on the ground. Our people are resilient. They have survived hardships most people will not experience in their time on Earth. And yet there is only so much our bodies are able to withstand, no matter our strength or determination. For me, each passing day on hunger strike is a searing reminder of that reality. Ending U.S. support for the blockade will single-handedly provide relief and restore hope for millions of Yemenis whose lives hang in the balance. We demand that the Biden administration act immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you everyone for coming out today at what was a celebration of peace and a demand to end this brutal war on Yemen. Now, I just want to let everyone know that 1 week from today, oh yes, yeah, Cole, you're right. Before you run off on me, we need a group photo so we can show everyone together demanding an end to this war. For those of you who are inclined to do so, I would encourage you to call your member of Congress and the administration to demand that they do everything they can to end this war and end it now. This is political, what we're doing here today, but it is not partisan. This began under the Obama administration, intensified under Donald Trump, and it continues under Joe Biden. It will continue until enough of us raise our voices loud enough to demand that this no longer goes on in our names and with our tax dollars. So please, everyone gather for a group photo so we can raise as much awareness as possible.